Good evening. I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. We turn attention to Asia, to China. It's in the news every day. It's part of the political discourse in the United States as we prepare for the 45th President of the United States. China is no longer regarded as a friend. China is no longer regarded as a partner. China is ready to be a foe of the United States, not just military, not just economic, but also in terms of, the word is propaganda. There must be a polite term for it. Gordon Chang, my friend and colleague and co-host, joins now. He's in Toronto of the Daily Beast. Gordon, is there a polite word for propaganda? Good evening to you, Gordon.
Probably not. And John, good evening to you as well. You know, there is propaganda. The Chinese government can spread it far and wide, but the question is, if you don't have anything good to say, are you getting anything for your money?
This is graduation time in New York and across the country, and it's wonderful to see the young people in their gowns accepting their rewards for study. I saw it today in New York. However, I see, Gordon, routinely lots of Chinese students, and good for them. They're heavily represented in the East Coast schools, high schools, private high schools, colleges, universities, lots of students from China. And when they come here, Gordon, do they have a sense of what is propaganda and what is not from the Chinese media?
I think that they do, especially when they come here, and they are actually keeping American education afloat, so good for them, and I'm glad that
I agree, yes.
I think that they sort of understand how a free society works. It might not affect their values too much when they go back to China, but I think that they do learn things which are impossible to forget.
We welcome a colleague of ours to measure Chinese propaganda. If Charles has a better word, I'll go for it. Charles is a professor at Brock University. Gordon is in Toronto, and Charles is in St. Catharines, which is in Toronto, and Charles tells me the weather is excellent in Canada right now, which is good to celebrate. Charles, a very good evening to you. Chinese government propaganda, represented in Australia, represented in Washington. Is it effective? Do the mandarins, it's a metaphor, the mandarins of the Chinese Communist Party believe that we are persuaded by this happy talk? Good evening to you.
Good evening. Well, I think that they do. I think they're inclined to think that we're as amenable to the same propaganda as the people in China are, but they put in these supplements of Chinese information produced by the China Daily in newspapers around the world. We have them in Canada and the Toronto Star from time to time. I think a more significant concern is that if newspapers become dependent on the Chinese printing, they print the supplements and make the money off the printing, would they then be reluctant to include articles critical of China in their editorial pages for fear of alienating the Chinese and losing that particular business, particularly in an era when newspapers are financially pressed? So I think if the Chinese government pressures newspapers not to publish articles unfriendly about China, or pressures advertisers who have business with China not to place advertisements in publications that the Chinese government has identified as writing articles unfriendly to China, then from that point of view, the Chinese will have been successful. But the number of people who read the China Daily Supplement in newspapers and actually believe it is probably relatively few. I think it's more about suppressing information than being able to effectively change the discourse on China.
Gordon?
Charles, I think you're absolutely right. If we look at Hong Kong, which is sort of a mini lab, clearly Beijing has been able to get newspapers not to print stuff about China that they don't want to see. And they have been able to do all the things that you have just mentioned. But on the other hand, we see Hong Kong society, who seems to be pretty defiant these days, pretty anti-Beijing, especially the young people. So in a sense, they've spent a lot of money in Hong Kong on the press. They don't seem to have gotten a very good return. And I suspect that we could say pretty much the same thing about Canada or the United States. They do buy some influence, but they spend an extraordinary amount of money doing it.
Yes, and I think a lot of it comes back to haunt them. We've had instances in Canada where the Chinese embassy has pressured overseas Chinese language publications to fire reporters or editors, and that story becomes a bigger story than what they were actually writing about. So I do think that it's similar to the Confucius Institutes, which I think have largely backfired on China because they're supposed to create an impression that China is a place that's inherited the great tradition of Chinese civilization, Confucius, but mostly what we hear about them is the suppression of free expression and the way that they're using textbooks to tell a history which is not actually all that factual.
Charles, you observe closely the presidential contest underway in the United States right now, and one candidate is outspoken in his opposition to Chinese trade practices. The other candidate is equally fervent about how the playing field will be leveled in the 45th presidency. Also, Mrs. Clinton represents right now active foreign policy in that the U.S. Navy is opposing the Chinese Navy in the South China Sea, and we can extend that to the Obama administration. Do the Chinese believe that they can reverse this by buying propaganda in our newspapers, that suddenly we'll stop listening to the candidates and the President of the United States about the confrontation?
Yes, I think that the Chinese hope that they can change the discourse. They regard the current way that China is depicted in the West as an inheritance of the imperialist incursions of the mid-19th century, and they think that people can be led to believe that China speaks more authoritatively about the nature of China than Western media. But objectively speaking, this isn't happening. I think in terms of the election, I've heard from Chinese people that they prefer Mr. Trump, strangely enough, because they think he's a businessman and therefore they can do business with him. And of course, as we know, he's received the endorsement of the North Korean government. So, I think you're going to get Trump as your next president.
Well, that's 1 billion votes just picked up by Trump. Gordon?
Charles, there's an issue of reciprocity here in that, for instance, Chinese cable networks have free access to cable providers in the West, specifically in the United States. And yet American networks like CNN do not have unrestricted access in China. With these newspaper supplements that are now appearing around the world, especially in Australia with this new deal with the Fairfax Group, the question is, why aren't the Western governments pressing China to allow free access so as to make their access to the West conditional on our access to China?
One would expect that would be reasonable. The New York Times produces a Chinese language edition, and unfortunately, it's blocked in China, so Chinese people can't read it over the internet, much less inserting it into Chinese papers as a supplement to promote the views of the New York Times. So you're quite right. Like so many things in China, such as foreign investment in the energy sector and so on, the Chinese are not offering any reciprocity, and nor do they expect that we should ask for reciprocity. So this is not something which is based on, a free marketplace of ideas. It's really based on the Chinese regime wanting to impose a discourse that they imposed domestically abroad.
Gordon, I ask a question for you, and then I'd like Charles to comment. Is it a good thing that we just run these newspaper advertisements? I understand they run the line at the top, advertisement, so that it's not news. But does that help the people of China that we put this propaganda in our newspapers?
I used to get hysterical about this and really upset, especially about reciprocity. I'm becoming maybe a little bit more tolerant, and the reason is that I've sort of believed now that if you don't have a good product to sell, you can spend a lot of money and it just isn't going to work. And I think that is the effect over time. But nonetheless, we're not defending our media companies in China, so I think that we should be using this as a reciprocity tool so that we can get our word into the Chinese nation, and we should be doing that, and that's a failure of our government.
Charles, your thought, is it a good thing that we permit this or we watch this happen without pushing back?
Well, I think a lot of newspapers wouldn't take advertisements that made false claims. You can't touch.
Yeah, they get fussy about political falsehoods, yes.
And so, I do think that from that point of view, there is a moral issue as to whether the newspaper wants to whether a Western newspaper wants to put out information that is not presenting a situation fairly and factually, despite the fact that, as Gordon says, they all have marked on them, this is an advertisement not produced by our editorial department. But I think the idea that we could get reciprocity in China is very, very remote. At present, for example, I'm able to watch Chinese TV over the internet. Chinese people are not able to watch our news broadcasts in China. And I do think in general, in terms of the management of relations between China and the West, that we should be taking up Gordon's suggestion and insisting on reciprocity. And so if they're not prepared to do what they expect to do in our countries and let us do the same thing in China, then we ought to simply say that we're not going to accept that and not give the requisite permissions for that to happen.
Gordon Chang of the Daily Beast and Charles Burton of Brock University. And I puzzle. We refuse tobacco products in our newspapers, don't we? I'm John Batchelor.